Yeah, so Mainzeal, I'm sure many of you will have heard this name in the news in the last several years, because it's actually ended up being a really key case for company law in New Zealand. And you could talk a great deal about it. It could take hours and hours. But I think some of the things that fell out for us around this case, in a nutshell, the company had been trading balance sheet insolvent for a number of years.
Okay, and what does that mean when you say insolvent? What does that mean?
So that means that they didn't technically have enough money to pay for the debts that they owed.
That's right. At the time when they were owed, right?
Yeah,
That's right. So
yeah,
let's say you have a loan, but the due date for that loan is 15 years from now, right? So you don't have to be worrying about I need enough cash at this particular moment to pay that debt because that's due 15 years from now.
yeah.
But if you cannot pay your debts as when they're due, then you're technically insolvent. And insolvent is actually a defined term within the Companies Act as well.
Yeah. And if we think about this and put it into a practical application, again, in the media, we're always hearing about companies that have gone into liquidation. And often, as a consequence of that, creditors can lose a lot of money. So they haven't been able to be paid because the company didn't have sufficient funds to pay them. And so that's really important because it's kind of a bit unfair for creditors to be participating in business with the company only to find, well, actually, they couldn't even be paid. And so that's a lot of the time what the news coverage focuses on and the unfairness of that. And so those insolvency provisions in the Companies Act are aimed to try and help people avoid getting into that position. And it's also really important to be aware that you can get advice early, and the earlier you get the advice, the better. And if you're a director and you have any concerns about your balance sheet or your solvency, our advice is get the advice early because that positions you well if something terrible does happen, and you can point to that and say, well, actually, we were thoughtful about it. We did give it consideration.
And just another highlight of the Mainzeal case, just to give a scale of what we're talking about. In the chat, I've put a link to an article that we wrote outlining some of the key things, but it was $110 million, right? Like this wasn't just, oh, we owe 20,000 or 50,000, $110 million. So just imagine the ripple effects of all the subcontractors, all the employees. I do a lot of presenting with the IOD, and I've had people in the courses when I'm talking about this, somebody's raised their hand and said, actually, I work in a construction business. We almost went under because we didn't get paid 700,000 from Mainzeal. And the other thing about Mainzeal, which is really fascinating, maybe two quick things. Number one, an ex-prime minister of New Zealand was held liable for 6 million plus. So it was real liability, and titles don't matter. If you've breached your duties, you could be held liable. But the second thing is that Sir Paul Collins was one of the directors. He was held not liable because he had asked the right questions, he had raised concerns, and the judge said, you did what you're meant to do. You fulfilled your duties, and therefore you are not liable like the other directors. So lots of amazing lessons from that case.
And one of the other really interesting things about the case, and it may or may not apply to smaller, closely held companies, Mainzeal really relied on assurances or promises from other companies that they would provide necessary funds as they were required. But they weren't secure assurances.
They weren't legally binding.
And so unfortunately, in the world of business, we'd love it to be, yes, let's do it on a handshake. You're going to get into trouble if you just rely on that. So you will need to do some due diligence and be a bit firm with your requirements to make sure that you can pay your debts as and when they fall due, and you don't fall into the position of becoming insolvent. And just another thing, it's not to do with Mainzeal, but something that people may not be aware of, is creditors, there is a hierarchy of creditors. So when a business does go into liquidation, creditors will be paid, if anything is available, according to that hierarchy. And the IRD is one of what we call the preferential creditors. So they will often get the first piece of cake, depending on how much cake is left. And often there's not very much cake, by the way. So do pay your taxes because they are something that you do need to do. And the IRD is one of the key entities that will try and press to put a company into liquidation if it isn't paying what it's meant to pay. But the good news is that if you find yourself feeling a little bit uncomfortable about your tax bill, give IRD a call. It's again about that early advice, getting information, because they are quite accommodating and are prepared to work with companies in some circumstances to work through what might be possible. So don't hide and be a mushroom. Make sure you take that early action.
The other thing just to throw in as well is there's a case of Debut Homes. So that came out before Mainzeal. But that was a really interesting one because basically the director / shareholder, to your point, multiple hats. The family trust had loaned money, like it was as intricately woven as you could get. The point is that in that case, the director made a decision not to pay GST to the IRD. It was about $600,000 of GST. So not the best entity to not provide that to. The reason is that he was preferring other creditors, people that he would have ongoing relationships with. IRD, faceless government entity, people I'll see in the street tomorrow, I'll pay them rather than them. So the court obviously came down quite heavily and said, you had a deliberate strategy to not pay the IRD. So he was held liable under your favorite sections.
And nobody likes paying tax. It's just one of those things that we have to do in life, right? But if you look at the policy reasons for paying tax, I mean, tax is what pays for a huge amount of what we need as a society. So we might not like to do it, and we might prefer to pay someone we'll have an ongoing relationship with, but you're just going to get into trouble if you do that.
So those are some of the director duties and things and the hats that you wear. I'm just wondering do you want to add a bit more on that, or should we talk about offers or some other?
Let's just spend a little bit more time on this particular topic as well, because I think it's important whenever you're running a company that there is a continuum of consideration that a director needs to have. So when the company is solvent, right, the director's duty is to basically act in the best interest of the company. So they have to put their minds and their motivations and their their entire thought process into what is best for the company. Now, as soon as you get into the gray zone where you're in the solvent / insolvent territory, where you think that you might be solvent, but it might be insolvent because of some liabilities coming up or some of your cash flow drying up or your accounts receivable not being paid. You get into this gray area where you have to not only think for what is in the best interest of the company, but you started to have to think about, okay, I also need to keep my creditors in mind. And it's this gray area that is actually the danger zone where you actually should go and get advice as quickly as possible and document all of your decisions in order to avoid the pitfall of if and when it goes from the gray area to fully insolvent, then at least during the gray area, you laid the foundations to be able to show that you've discharged your duty vis-a-vis the creditors. Now, that's an interesting part because as soon as you move away from the gray area and you go into fully insolvent, the company is no longer able to think of what's in the best interest of the company. At that point, you have to focus your attentions on how can I make sure that the creditors are not prejudiced by the actions that the directors are taking at this point. And in fact, if and when you become insolvent, your discretion might be taken away from you because there might be a liquidator that is appointed or there might be a receiver that is appointed to your company if you've basically given some security interest over the assets of your company. The last thing that I'd like to say is with regards to officers. Now, officers are officers of the company. So typically these are your CEO, CFO, it can be a general manager. These are people that are, when we think of officers, we tend to think of people as employed by the company. So these are the people that actually do the day-to-day management of the company. And whenever you are trying to make a distinction as to what type of decision is this a shareholder decision? Is this a director decision? Or is this an officer slash management decision? The characteristics of the decision and the impact of those decisions is what's going to make the difference in making a judgment call as to whether or not this is a shareholder, a director, or a management decision. So officers are, for lack of a better word, they're in charge of the day-to-day management of a company. So should I buy white paper or should I buy yellow paper? Let the managers decide, right? Directors are in charge of the governance of the company. Governance is on a higher level than management. This is where are we? Where are we trying to get to? What is our 5-year plan? What is the direction that we're going to? These are the captains that make the decision of where to steer the ship, right? That's governance decision. Shareholders are even above that. Shareholders, unless there's a shareholders agreement or something like that that specifically says that the company needs to go to the shareholders for their approval of certain decisions, shareholders are only involved in super, super, super important decisions. That's defined within the Companies Act as a major transaction. So that's basically a transaction that would basically affect a huge percentage of the company's assets or liabilities. So this is a big, big, big transaction, basically. So for example, you're selling the entire business, or you're selling or up to half of the business. You're selling the only warehouse that the business has, for example.
Or a major acquisition.
Or a major acquisition, that's right. If you're going to spend a lot of money in order to buy an asset, so I'm going to buy a new warehouse and this new warehouse is going to be on the balance sheet more than half of my entire current balance sheet. A decision to amend or change the Constitution. The Constitution is one of the governing documents of a company, and we will get to that hopefully later on in this discussion. But if you're going to change the founding rules of your company, obviously you want the shareholders to be involved in that. And then decisions to liquidate the company if, for example, you get to a point where you say, okay, this company has run its course, we need to wind it up and shut it down. That's also a shareholder's decision. So whenever you come to a decision point, you have to take the time and make a judgment call. And if not, if you can't make the judgment call, talk to your legal advisors on, hey, is this a board of directors decision? Is this a shareholder decision? Or is this just a normal everyday management decision? Now, within this spectrum, there's also the ability to delegate, right? So, for example, the board might be comfortable enough to say, for these types of decisions, which ostensibly need to be a board decision, we've made the choice to delegate the decision to a committee, the CEO, etc. Now, the responsibility for that decision, once it's made, still remains with the board, but the board has made the decision to delegate the particular choice to somebody else. If that makes sense.
And that's why you see often there will be subcommittees of the board, or there might be an audit and risk committee or a health and safety committee or other things. So the whole board doesn't need to consider all of it in detail. But
that's right.
But here's the key thing. Ultimately, who's responsible? It's the board. So you can't just say, well, I didn't know about the health and safety because we had a committee doing that. That's not going to fly. Ultimately, you are responsible. And maybe the final bit on this part. By the way, we'd love to have questions. So please feel free in the comments, just type us a question, basically on any topic. We're open, life advice even, right? Just feel free. We're really happy to engage and make this interactive. But I was just going to say the hats thing. Sometimes it's more complicated than I'm taking off this hat and putting on the other hat. An example might be you're a shareholder and a director. Is it ever truly possible to take off your shareholder hat and put your director hat on? The reality is we're human beings, and I don't think you would ever lose sight of the fact that you're a shareholder. But from a legal perspective, you have duties as a director to fulfill. So for example, as a shareholder, you might want to get a dividend. Like, I
Mhm.
want some money, please. But as a director, you have to say it's not in the best interest of the company to issue a dividend. So it gets gray, it's complicated, but we're just trying to set out some of the frameworks to keep you safe and understand that.